this was the beginning of civil rights, probably birthed right there. And Martin Luther King, Quincy Newman, who was in Columbia,
Right.
were non-violent. They believed that they followed Gandhi and said that wasn't true. I consider myself a pacifist. So this is really an interesting question to me. Tubman, Hunter, obviously Saxton and Higginson did not feel that way. Could you speak to that at all, or maybe your opinion of that, or?
There had always been a difference of opinion in the abolitionist movement between those like William Lloyd Garrison, who wanted abolitionism promoted and slaves, let me back up. There had always been a difference of opinion in the abolitionist movement between the supporters of William Lloyd Garrison, who wanted violent actions against slaveholders. The masthead of his newspaper, The Liberator, stated, "No union with slaveholders." And those who wanted a more middle-of-the-road, ameliorative type of response. For example, even someone like Emerson raised the argument of freeing the slaves by buying them from the slaveholders and saying that Americans all over the North would raise up and said that Americans all over the North would rise up and contribute to the fund to free the slaves. The idea that they did deserve compensation for what was, in their minds, their property. Then there was the Back to Africa movement, which became known mainly in the late 19th century by Marcus Garvey, that held that the slaves should be shipped back to Africa where they could be free people again in their own country. Even someone like Henry Thoreau was attracted to this for a short time. As the century progressed, and as you had the annexation of Texas, and as you had questions over the boundaries of states, and as you had questions over slavery encroaching upon the rest of the country as the country expanded, it became obvious that a peaceful solution would not work. Emerson, when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, wrote in his journal, "I will not obey this by God," because it was the South using the courts in the North to force people to work against their conscience. And this continued through the 1850s, through numerous incidents, treaties, events like the caning of Charles Sumner, to the point where it was impossible to argue for nonviolence anymore when you were dealing with a group of people against whom that did not work and who were being not necessarily demonized, but portrayed in the public's eyes as people who were violent themselves. I mean, when you have people enslaving other people and brutalizing them, it's hard to look at them as people who will respond to nonviolent actions.
That's just such an interesting,
It is.
And Lincoln said, even if we do this, it's going to take another 100 years. And then in 100 years, of course, there was much violence, but the main leaders were speaking nonviolence. So that's interesting. Let's see. I also wanted to talk about some of the other people that were floating around there, like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Margaret Fuller kind of was already gone before that. And one of those things that's so interesting that I had read a long time ago, that a big statue of John C. Calhoun was coming back on the boat
With Fuller. I think Hiram Powers statue, of Calhoun, yeah.
But I thought that was just an amazing story. So there was Hawthorne. There was who was Moby Dick?
Melville.
There was all of those people around in that same area, and could you sort of speak about the literature, Emily Dickinson, Longfellow, Walt Whitman?
Right, back up for a second in my mind. When you look at the so-called major writers of the American Renaissance, you have Poe, Hawthorne, Melville, Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman. Three of them lived in Concord, either most of their lives or for a significant portion. That would be Hawthorne, Thoreau, and Emerson. Melville was from New York State and did live in Pittsfield, Massachusetts for a while before, and a mission to raise people up to the quality of goodness that he feels is inherent in them. So there's that possibility. If someone else had been sent who looked at what were then called the Negroes or the coloreds or the contraband as a negative force, as people who were subhuman, as people who could not be educated, then I think history would have shown a very different result.
Doesn't that just blow your mind?
Yeah. The right person at the right time. Yeah, look at
It's so big
Yeah.
that I can't. Well, so in the meantime, there has been a book written called Lincoln's Gamble. None of it, which, by the way, mentions Port Royal, but it was written by Todd Brewster, who wrote the Chronicle books with Peter Jennings, and he goes through the last 6 months of Lincoln going back and forth and stalling between actually signing the Emancipation Proclamation. So these are a lot of things that I still I have to tie up, but it appears to me by who was there and a South Carolina tie-in is Charles Sumner.
Yeah.
Where is he in this? Because he is very active in the same period of time. He got the crap beat out of him by Preston Brooks from Edgefield, and so there's that part of it too.
But the caning of Charles Sumner on the floor of the United States Senate was one of those turning points, like the rendition of Anthony Sims, like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, like the Fugitive Slave Act, like John Brown at Harper's Ferry, that turned people's opinion. How could you want to work with people who would assault a representative of your state on the floor of the United States Senate and beat him almost senseless? It was, again, one of those turning points. Emerson lectured on it in print. Other people wrote letters to the editor. Sumner was a hero for standing up for the cause of abolitionism. And, of course, Preston Brooks was painted as another Southerner resorting to violence. How can you make peace with these people?
Yeah, every time I go into the Caroliniana, I'm like, really?
Yes. Yeah.
But then they have a statue of Ben Tillman. That's a whole other story.
Yes, but at least they don't have Tillman Hall.
So, in the midst of this is, I believe, Frederick Douglass, who's, do you know where he might have been? And he or Harriet Tubman, who came down to Port Royal, but who was also in and out, and I'm not quite sure how much, but I know Higginson knew her.
Yeah, I don't know where Douglass was at this period.
Okay.
He was back in the States because I think he went to England in the 50s. I think he was back in the States, but beyond that, I don't know. But one interesting connection, going back to Emerson, is if reading the reports of the celebrations on the 1st of January, 1863, when it became clear that Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and the way the blacks reacted to that, with joy, with quiet, with respectfulness, with adultness, is very parallel to what Emerson wrote about in his 1844 address upon the emancipation of the slaves in the British West Indies. When they were emancipated, the British felt that there would be riots, that they would turn on their owners, they would burn down the plantations, they would create mayhem. Their response was identical to the response of the slaves in 1863 in Beaufort. Joy, happiness, an adult reaction, a realization that they were entering a new phase of their lives. So in this you have a parallel, and it's a parallel that argues very strongly against the fears of slaveholders, which were ironically exacerbated by Higginson's regiment because it showed them what they always feared, slaves rising up in rebellion against their masters. Whereas to Higginson and the abolitionists, it shows that slaves were people too and would fight for their freedom.
And actually, they did not know that Lincoln had signed for another 7 days.
That's right, yeah.
They went ahead, and that was something I wanted.
People instead of, say, just a single author dissertation. And I've been plugging away ever since. I've done books on Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Transcendentalism, Whitman, mainly bibliographical and editorial work.
That's amazing. Yeah, that you would have this kind of broad, because this is like just a few of the people that are all involved in this.
Yeah, may I say?
Yeah. Those are just my notes, but all of these people were milling around. Yeah, and I believe that the linchpin for this, that Saxton got down there and he knew the guy to bring down was Higginson.
Yeah.
Had you heard of Higginson before
Oh, yeah.
this?
Higginson, I think, made the history of this more accessible than anyone else through his publications and writings after the war. He lived until, I think, what was it, 1908? So he was really at the cusp of the second generation of transcendentalists. When he was in his teens, I believe, he submitted an article to the Dial that was turned down. So he knew all these people. As you said in your email, he had rescued Ellery Channing's wife when Ellery was on one of his walkabouts. He was a really major figure at the time. Unfortunately, someone is writing a biography of him right now. So if you go further in your work, I'll give you her name, because she's gone through all the letters and journals.
Oh gosh, I'd love that. Is she local? Where is she?
No, she's at Penn State Altoona.
Interesting. I mean, transcendentalism is a very hard thing to understand. What's kind of your beginner's explanation of transcendentalism?
To begin with, there's no one definition that includes everyone in the movement. One of the participants in the movement, the Unitarian minister James Freeman Clark, once said, "We're called the Club of the Like-Minded because none of us think alike." So there's a problem with people approaching transcendentalism that I always call hermeneutical paralysis. You want to understand it, and because you can't understand it, you freeze. It is a broadly based movement of primarily Unitarian clergy who were opposed to what was then the status quo in literature, religion, and philosophy, and they provided alternatives to it. Not all of them agreed on anything. Some of them left the Unitarian Church. Some of them stayed in the Unitarian Church. In fact, two of them became the presidents of the American Unitarian Association later in their lives. So it's not simple. It's not like naturalism or realism where you can come up with a nice couple sentences and get away with a definition. Transcendentalism is much more encompassing. And for a movement that places the emphasis on the individual, it makes sense that they not have a prescriptive type of definition.
That's really good. It makes me feel better because as I'm trying to pull this down and look at some of the things that for example, Higginson, you would think of the transcendental movement as something very nonviolent that would be influenced by Emerson, nature, and yet Higginson is one of the Secret Six of John Brown. So there's this knowledge that you need to be inclusive and you need to do that, but he was pretty clear that he felt that the only way that they could win the war was.
Well, by around 1850, the sense of cohesiveness that the Transcendentalists had was pretty much blown apart. So to try to apply that definition to a group after about 1850 is fraught with difficulties. The best you can do, I think, is to talk about, and I think you allude to this in your emails, to talk about the influence the group had rather than them as a unifying force. John Brown sort of was the demarcation point for most of them, where you have Henry Thoreau talking about him as the martyr, and even Emerson, who was nonviolent, beginning to move more in the direction of action. But Higginson was always an ardent abolitionist. He was a disunionist from the beginning.
And I read